rare you see anything, but it's all pretty open and pretty normal. A lot of people my age and older, we're still staying at home most of the time, but the youngsters are out as usual, especially at weekends. Schools, adult, university, and the equivalent of A-level college, they're only online teaching, so they're closed. But normal schools and nurseries are open just as usual.
Right.
Very good.
Yeah,
well, we have a huge death level. More people pro rata have died here than in England.
Oh, really?
Is that right?
Yeah, it's gone over 4,000 now, and we're less than 10 million people.
Okay.
So their strategy hasn't worked, but a lot of it's in care homes. It's been dreadful, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Same here.
Same here.
Yeah, it's frightening.
Yes, the elderly are very, very vulnerable.
Hi, good evening.
I know, but they're going
to. Hi everyone, good evening.
It was your screen, not mine.
Okay, good evening everyone. Good evening, Dayan Binstock. I've just muted everybody, except for Dayan Binstock and Rabbi Menzel, who should both be unmuted. Okay, good evening.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here this evening at this Zoom Tikkun. So it's great that everyone can join in, and we're looking forward to our program this evening. We're going to have 3 presentations, one from myself, one from Rabbi Mendel, and one from Rabbi Yoni, that for the first hour. And then we're going to have a question and answer session, which will be chaired by Sophia Breslau, where you can pose whatever question you like to any one of us as far as the questions are concerned. So friends, if you have downloaded the sheets that I sent out, the texts that are going to go with my share, my presentation this evening is on the subject of Jewish space tourism. Now, I was interested in this subject, and I hadn't realized till a couple of days ago how apposite it is. In about an hour and a half from now, weather permitting, there will be a launch from Cape Canaveral of the astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken, and they're set to be the first human passengers on a commercial SpaceX spacecraft. Up to now, every launch that has been by governments, Russia mainly, some from Europe, and America's not put anyone into space till 2011. And this spacecraft has been designed with as far as Elon Musk is concerned, and it's the first stage. If this works, it will lead to the possibility of space tourism itself, and that is something that's a very exciting prospect. I want to examine some of the issues that could be relevant as far as this is concerned. Now, from a Jewish point of view, we've always looked up and thought from the stars what it might be to look down. You look in the words of the prophets and the Psalms, you'll see those sorts of ideas. That Isaiah, it says, he looks down from the orb of the earth and sees the inhabitants like grasshoppers. In other words, the prophet can picture what it might be like to look down from the sky and just see very, very tiny figures. And in the Psalms, we say, if I fly up to heaven, you are there. If I go to the depths, you are there too. And so we've always had this notion that wherever we might be, we will find the Almighty. And you may recall the words that were said by the early astronauts when he broadcast back to Earth, quoting words from the Bible as he saw the orb of the moon and he saw the orb of the earth. And so, is this an issue for Jews? Now, you might think that's rather academic. There have been some Jewish astronauts. You look in Wikipedia, you'll find a list of some 16 Jewish astronauts. But about a year ago, I was asked a question by a member of our synagogue who's actually logged in this evening, David Chilling, who is planning to be an astronaut. He wants to be a space tourist. And so we started to discuss some of the issues. And there are certainly amongst our community, there's at least one young man who is extremely well informed about all aspects of space travel. And so the questions are not simply academic anymore. There are questions we have to think about from a realistic Jewish point of view. What are the issues? So there is a question that comes about, is this a dangerous activity? Might it be deemed to be too dangerous for a Jew to undertake? Well, in discussing with David Schilling, I came to understand that there is an enormous amount of preparation that goes into every space launch. When you see Lewis Hamilton go up to get into his F1 car, there are more than 500 people behind him from his Mercedes team, with the engineers, the technicians, etc., that they're there in order to support that single person going to drive an F1 car. When an astronaut like these guys, Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken, are going to go out to go into their spacecraft, there are at least thousands of people behind each one of them who have been organizing and analyzing and calculating and so on. And so every single possibility has been attempted to be thought of. So in terms of its safety, it's not an unsafe activity. We were so shocked when Ilan Ramon died in his mission, his KABBALAH mission, because it was so unexpected. And so many causes, concerns for safety have been addressed. However, there is a very basic Jewish problem as far as going into a spacecraft is concerned. In order to become an astronaut, if you're a professional astronaut, it's years of training. You want to be a space tourist, there's a fitness test, and at least 15 weeks of training, so David Schilling tells me. And then you've got to get to Cape Canaveral and spend at least a week there preparing and climatizing. There are some, as it were, dry runs that you do in preparatory modules, but you never know exactly when you're going to go onto the spacecraft. There can be a provisional date, but there might not be. So this, of course, has problems of Shabbat. If you are going to go on a boat on Shabbat, you can't go into the boat on Shabbat. Indeed, the authorities of the Shulchan Aruch, based on the Talmud, say you've got to get on there at least 3 days before. Under certain circumstances, perhaps on a Friday, but to actually go onto the module on Shabbat and be flown up into space, that would be a classic problem from a halachic point of view. So that's an issue which any would-be Jewish space tourist is going to have to address. Danger aside, how would one manage with the time-bound mitzvot of Judaism? And are there any lessons we can learn from this imagination of Jewish space travel that could be there for us under Corona lockdown? So 15 years ago, when the Apollo landing first took place on the moon, it provoked a number of rabbinic responses, and a number of rabbis wrote essays. There was a Rabbi Menachem Kasher who wrote an essay and then expanded it into a book called Adam al Hayarech, Man on the Moon. And he says, in my humble opinion, he said, it's very clear that the Torah's obligation that's upon us to keep the mitzvot is on everybody, wherever you are. Whether you're on land or you're on sea, on the moon, in the North Pole, South Pole, etc., wherever you are, you've got to keep the mitzvot. And as long as you're alive and able, you have to keep the mitzvot, and you can't transgress them. And if things are beyond your control, okay, then we say Rahmana, KODESH Baruch Hu forgives you if you're under those circumstances. But when it's not beyond your, but when it is within your control, you have to do them. And there's no place where a Jew could be absolved from the mitzvot. And so according to Rabbi Kasher, you'd have to keep the mitzvot as best you could. If you are in space, you are on the moon. Now, when Ilan Ramon, the Israeli astronaut, was about to embark on his mission, on the Columbia mission, he began talking to his rabbis, and he began to see himself as a representative of the Jewish people. And I know how proud I was, and how proud so many people across the Jewish world were, that this guy is going up into space and Israeli is going to go into and he spoke to Rabbi Tzvi Konikov, who is the rabbi of the Cape Canaveral, about Shabbat. What should he do? The rabbi didn't know, so he asked other rabbis, and the questions got processed and so on. The answer, he first asked the question about kosher food. And he was told, yes, you can keep, they made provision for him to have kosher food in space. But as far as Shabbat was concerned, he was told, well, you should observe Shabbat as it would be in Cape Canaveral. So imagine that the time you are in the spacecraft is what it would be in Cape Canaveral. But it turns out the issue is a much more complex one than that. And a lot began to be written on the subject. And there was a very important rabbi, sadly he's now passed away, but Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Halperin, he wrote a book on mitzvot in space called Im Esak Shamayim, If I Fly to the Heavens. And I'm going to quote from it as we move through our presentation. And so Rabbi Halperin works through a number of options. So let's work out logically, what could it be? You're up there in a space module and you're whizzing around the Earth and you're traveling around the Earth once every 90 minutes. And so you're seeing sunrise, sunset, etc. So what would it be as far as the mitzvot are concerned? Well, clearly, all the negative mitzvot would apply to you. Don't have any permission to eat non-kosher food, unless, of course, your life is in danger. But, things that you're not allowed to do, of course, you have to keep. If were you to be up there on Pesach, you couldn't eat chametz. But what about the positive mitzvot? What does it do about morning service, evening service, tefillin, and especially Shabbat? And so he thought of a few options. He says one option could be, he says that, well, the time for you, and therefore what you should do as far as these mitzvot are concerned, is the time you're observing outside your spacecraft or space station. If you see the sunrise, it's day. If you see sunset, then it is night. And so you said, have to consider each time the shuttle orbits the globe every 90 minutes, that will be one complete day, including both a nighttime and a daytime. And therefore, there end up being 16 complete days within a 24-hour period. And he says, we follow a biblical idea, Vayi Erev, Vayi Boker, it was evening and it was morning, that's one day. And so you could argue a day would be when you see a sunrise and a sunset. But were you to follow that logic through, then you have to read the Shema 32 times a day. You'd have to put on tefillin every hour and a half, pray 48 prayers, etc., and you'll have 2 Sabbaths every 24-hour periods, which is bizarre and it's ridiculous. So that's possibility number one, a logical possibility, but leads to bizarre conclusions. Possibility number two is similar and almost equally bizarre, is that the time that you observe yourself to have in the space module is not what you're seeing outside of you, but what's happening on the ground beneath you. So directly over the place you are flying, that would be your time. Okay, so that's the idea. So the possibility is that it's not what you observe outside the aircraft, the spacecraft, is what's being observed on the Earth below you, if of course you are in an orbit around the Earth. And so that means the astronaut would act in accordance with the time of the place he's passing over, applies both to day and to night. He would count if he's flying over a place with his Shabbat, he has to observe Shabbat. If he's flying over a place where it's not Shabbat, he doesn't have to observe Shabbat. It'll be rather strange because Shabbat will be coming in and out all the time. And so, of course, that also leads to bizarre possibilities. But that's a logical way of trying to analyze situations. So either it's the time of what's around you or the time of the Earth below you. And then he considers a third possibility. And the third possibility might be is not to follow an outside reference or an Earth reference, but to follow an internal reference. And the laws of the Torah are to be given to be observed in a 24-hour night-day schedule, and you would create your own time zone within your space capsule, within the place where you were. And he says it's possible to determine the complete day for him will finish after 24 hours pass. 12 of them will be day, 12 of them will be night, totally ignoring what might be going on outside the space shuttle, whether it's orbiting above a part of the Earth, which is daylight, or whether it's orbiting above a part of the Earth that it's in night. We would ignore that. And he would just take the first 12 hours as night and the next 12 hours a day with all the obligations that would go with that. So in the 12 hours which we are observing as day, you'd have the tefillin, you'd have the morning prayers, and then the afternoon prayers, etc. Then in the 12-hour period that's night, he would have the evening prayers and so on. And so you'd have all the leniencies and all the stringencies of the Torah in that zone he's created for himself. But Rabbi Halperin says, after further analysis and consideration, he comes to the following conclusion. He says, being in outer space is not a place where time-bound mitzvot would apply. The Torah has been given to us to be observed on Earth. And he says, if a person is flying in a space shuttle and orbits the Earth in a way that as a result of his orbit, light and darkness are frequently changing for him, He has created his own time system, but that's not within the order of the laws of creation as far as the Torah is concerned. He said the Torah's system is based solely on the order of the paths of the planets and the stars, the sun and the moon for man on earth. It's not determined by someone who's up in a spacecraft outside of the earth. And therefore, he says, it seems obvious to him that as far as space is concerned, the mitzvot and laws that are dependent on day and night, the week, the month, the year, are not applicable. And so these are only applicable to someone living in a place that's following the order of creation. And so as far as Rabbi Helper is concerned, as far as Torah law is concerned, you go up in space, you're in the space shuttle, you're not obligated to observe those mitzvot that are dependent upon time. However, he says at a rabbinical level, it's right that a person should fulfill these mitzvot, so should not lose consciousness of them. And that's his view. There's a contemporary rabbi in Jerusalem, Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch of the Eidah Haredis, a very Haredi rabbi, but nevertheless he examines and explores many, many modern questions, and he agrees with this conclusion. And he says, in reference number 6, it seems that we have received the Torah with the times as they are in our world. Someone who leaves this world absolves himself of the mitzvot that are dependent on time, such as Shabbat, the holidays, etc. However, Rabbi Sternbuch has, as it were, a sting in the tail. He says, why should we want to be in a place where we can't keep the mitzvot? Surely the aspiration of every Jew should be to be in a place where I can keep the mitzvot. And therefore, he doesn't like the idea of space travel because it would be putting a person in a situation where you wouldn't be able to keep the mitzvot. He also has other concerns. He says, you're spending so much money, could be help so many poor and sick people, all the hospitals you could build, and so on and so forth. And so he has other, as it were, social considerations. But from a halachic point of view, he would say, A, that if you're up in space, you are exempt. But B, he doesn't like the idea of putting yourself in a place where you are exempt. There is a very well-known and leading rabbi and thinker in America, Rabbi J. David Bleich, who's written on a number of contemporary issues, already published about 7 or more volumes on contemporary halachic problems, and he analyzes this question in volume 5. And he says philosophically, he also argues that someone who is in outer space has transcended the zone for time-bound mitzvot. You're in outer space, you're not on earth, you're not obligated to keep time-bound mitzvot. And he has an analogy of a carousel. So you have the roundabout going round, and someone steps off the roundabout, and he sees the roundabout going round, but he's not on it. And then he gets back on in the same place where he was, and he's now rejoined the roundabout. And so says Rabbi Bleich, when someone is up in outer space, then you have left the zone of the mitzvot. You're not obligated. Come back down to earth again, then you are obligated. And just as you have a geographical analogy, you're in Israel, you have to keep the mitzvot that are dependent on someone in Israel. Leave Israel, you're no longer required to keep those mitzvot that need to be performed in Israel. And so, whilst personal mitzvot would apply, that those mitzvot, those laws and commandments that depend on time, would no longer be applicable to you. However, Rabbi Bleich makes a very interesting, and for him a very important distinction between the person who travels up to outer space and the person who is in an orbit round the earth. He argues that if you are in an orbit round the earth, you are tied to the earth. Let me explain why. He says that our Shabbat times that we observe are fixed by ground level observations. So you are on the ground floor of the building and, you see the sunset. If it was an extremely tall building, say 100 floors, and you're on the top floor, there'll be a very small time difference between sunset on the ground floor and sunset on the 100th floor. Do we say the person on the 100th floor has got more time because the sun has not yet set for him? No. Your Shabbat times are fixed by what the observations are at ground level, okay? Let's take this a stage further. Say you were in an air balloon that was a few hundred feet above the ground. You can see the sun for longer before it sets. Would you say the person in the air balloon is not yet Shabbat for him because the sun has not set? No, you would say that it's fixed as where you are as far as the ground level observation is concerned. and say you are in an aircraft that's 35,000 feet above the ground, exactly the same. And therefore, says Rabbi Bleich, and if you were in a shuttle that was orbiting 400 kilometers above the ground, the same would be the case. And so says, therefore, Rabbi Bleich, you are fixed by the ground level observation of the place you are. If you clear the Earth's orbit, you wouldn't be obligated at all. But if you are in orbit around the Earth, then you'll be tied to what is happening on the ground below. But now we're back with the position, one of the positions that Rabbi Halperin rejected, which he said seemed to be ridiculous. Is it not bizarre? You're flying over New York when it's 1 p.m. At that time, it's 8 p.m. in Jerusalem. 1 p.m., so our astronaut would have had his Daven Shachris, Daven Musaf, had his Shabbos lunch, etc. And an hour later, he'll be over Jerusalem, where locally now it's 9 p.m. 9 p.m. is no longer Shabbat. Make Havdalah, Daven Mariv, etc. Problems about lighting candles in the space shuttle, but it would be out of Shabbat for you. However, it's only 2 p.m. in New York, but he's flying over Jerusalem where it's 9 p.m., so Shabbat is over. But half an hour later, he's over New York where it's only 2:30 p.m. So therefore, says Rabbi Bleich, he has to start keeping Shabbat again. And so the cycles would repeat themselves. Although Rabbi Halperin rejected this view because it seemed bizarre, Rabbi Bleich feels compelled to follow the consequences of his logic. He says, you're choosing to fly in such a manner, you have to accept the consequence of your choices. You're inside Jerusalem, this is one rule. Outside Jerusalem, you're another rule. You walk into a shul, certain rules apply. Walk out the shul, other rules apply. If you are in an orbit, then you're over a place with Shabbat, it's Shabbat outside. We do apply this principle to a certain extent in a slightly less bizarre way. Someone who's fasting, one of the fast days, and he's on a flight to Israel. And so his fast ends when it's nightfall. Now, when he's left in England, there may be a couple of more hours you still have to fast. But now he's fallen into nightfall, doesn't have to fast anymore. And so he can end his fast. If for some reason the plane has to turn back, got to stop eating. The fast recommences for you. And so your time is determined, says Rabbi Bleich, from where it is locally a bit below you. So nevertheless, Rabbi Bleich has one sort of consolation. You wouldn't be any to say Kiddush more than once a day. All right, my time is running out, but just a little reflection as far as for lessons for us under lockdown. It's been very difficult to keep our religion as we would have wished under lockdown. We haven't been able to have minyanim in the normal way, but what we've tried to do is to do as much as we can, whatever the circumstances. And the purpose of this rabbinic exploration is to see that wherever a Jew may be, how much of my religion can I keep? How much can I still connect to God, whatever the challenges may be? There will be new challenges, bizarre challenges, and in the course of the next 20 years, space tourism is bound to be taking place much more straightforwardly when you have to start thinking about the issues now and how can we connect to God wherever we are, whether it's down on Earth or up in a space shuttle, even maybe up on Mars. Thank you. Rabbi Mendel, I think you're on next. Your presentation is next.
Dayan Binstock. Can you hear me? Am I on?
Yeah.
I once was flying from Los Angeles to Melbourne, and my flight was delayed by 14 hours. We were sitting on the runway, and by the time we took off, it was the 16th of Tammuz, and when we landed in Australia, it was the 18th of Tammuz. So the 17th of Tammuz actually didn't even exist. I asked a question as I was on the plane whether I should get off. He said if it would have been Tisha B'Av, he would have told me to get off the flight. Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for participating and joining us. The topic of that I will be sharing with you is Anochi Hashem Elokecha, the first of the 10 commandments. Is it a command, in fact, or is it actually a statement? But I'm going to share a screen so everybody can follow because it went out a little bit late, the source sheet. And in Shul on Shavuot, we are unable to share screens, and we're usually having cheesecake, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning, and different shifts. So here we have new technology where we are able to join together. Just by way of introduction, there was an elderly gentleman who went to the doctors, and he asked the doctor. He said, "Doctor, I got a problem. My wife isn't hearing me properly because I keep asking for things, and I think a hearing must be going." So the doctor said, "Listen, when you get home tonight, I want you to do the following. Go a few feet behind her in the kitchen, perhaps so she can't see you, and ask her a question. And as you get closer, begin at 15 feet, and then we'll be able to measure it." So he gets home, he goes into the kitchen, he's 15 feet behind, and he starts saying, "Darling, what's for dinner?" No response. He takes another step forward. "Darling, what's for dinner?" Still no response. Third step, "Darling, what?" But after 4 steps, she turns around and says, "I've already told you 4 times, it's chicken. Are you deaf or something?" But the reason I bring that up is because one of the challenges we have, generally when we talk about any topic, certainly one such as big as belief, is a linguistic issue. And that is, what do you mean when you say a particular term? So by way of introduction, I want to just define the following 2 terms. If you're on a phone, you can pinch in to see it bigger. If you're not, I will be explaining it as I go along as well. So when you say "I know something" or "to know something," what is it that you mean? So the usual definition is to have information in your mind. You know what time it is. You have that piece of information in your mind. It might be to recognize someone or something. I know Mr. Bloggs, so you recognize and you know that person. That is the classic terminology when we use the word "to know." What does it mean when we say "to believe"? So this isn't quite as simplistic, but it perhaps is as well. Number 1, to think that something is true, correct, or real. I believe the earth is round and not flat, or I believe the evidence that you are telling me. I believe that the train has an engine that makes it go. Under religion, belief has a slightly different context, and that is action or conduct indicating belief in, obedience to, and reverence for a god, gods, or similar superhuman powers, the performance of religious rites or observances. So while belief generally is an assumption or a proposition, as the philosophers like to call it, of the world around us, a belief in a religious perspective is a religious act and obedience which might not necessarily be inconsistent with other realities around us, which, by the way, is what leads most of those that have issues with religion and with faith to say, what does it mean you believe? You have to rationalize your belief. That's because they look at belief in its evolved state, that it's a preconception of the world or of the way you perceive things, and now you need to prove that that's the case. If you believe that the sun rises, well, you've seen that it rose, so your belief is now confirmed. But if you believe that a prophet went up in a chariot, we need to understand how that's happened if he wasn't catapulted out of NASA. So again, that is how they are able to do it, to question beliefs. What we're going to hopefully do today is change a little bit of our perspective of beliefs by analysing it further. By the way, I've got that from Cambridge and Oxford dictionaries, those definitions. Now, in Judaism, the Hebrew tongue, LASHON HaKODESH, is more than just a language of how two Homo sapiens interacting in a social cohesion have created a way to exercise association of particular things. When a word is in LASHON HaKODESH in its form, it is considered the essence of what that thing is. So when we say emunah, what are we referring to? When we say yediyah, to know, what does it actually mean? What we're hopefully going to try and get to is emunah is if you take the middle letters of it, it's like the word amen, which means truth. So be it, to believe. Da'at is to know, to knowledge. But we're going to take it slightly differently than its usual context. So in synopsis, what we've said so far, is that belief and knowledge, the way we perceive it in the world, is factual things that are information that are in our mind or recognitions of things. And belief is the way we associate our perceptions of reality around us, or religious expressions as well. So that is the overall, and we're going to go through it into the Hebrew. So, going back to our topic for today, the 10 commandments, or the Aseret HaDibrot, as they are known. Now, 9 of them are quite clear: do's and don'ts. Observe the Shabbat, don't commit adultery, don't be jealous, etc. One of them, however, Shemot 20, which is where it is, verse number 1 and 2, is not so clear what it is. God spoke all these words to respond, was saying, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God, who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Then it goes on to the second command. So what is this? Is this a statement? Is it a mitzvah? What is God saying with this first of the 10 commands? So, as all things in the Torah, it is hotly debated by the sages. The first opinion we're going to begin is the Baal Halachot Gedolot. By way of introduction, just one point, the Torah as we know it today with 613 commandments is in the Talmud. The Talmud says there's 613 commands. But the first time we find any reference to a number, or at least most of them, is a few years later in the Gaonic period. The Talmud is from 200 of the Common Era till around 590 of the Common Era, and then there's the Gaonim period, which it begins around 589, 590. One of the early Gaonim was a rabbi called Rabbi Shimon Kayara, and he wrote a book called Baal Halachot Gedolot. My screen went off. He wrote a book called Baal Halachot Gedolot, and he says it is not a mitzvah to believe. Rather, what is God saying in this first sentence? It's a source and principle for all of the commands. Kingship, accept God's kingship, then my mitzvot. What then is the statement that God is talking about? It's the reference to the experiences and the revelations and the miracles that the Jewish people had experienced on their way out of Egypt. In other words, the God that took you out of Egypt, I'm that God, I am now your king, I want to be your leader, please follow my commands. And therefore the first one is not a mitzvah according to the Baal Halachot Gedolot. Rav Chistai, who is a 14th century sage, goes even a step further as to why it's not a mitzvah. He says not only it's not a mitzvah because it's a general principle, it's actually a mistake to call it a mitzvah. Why? I'll give you an example. Imagine it's your first day at school, and the headmaster comes into the auditorium and all the kids are around, and the headmaster says, here is the book with which you have to behave within the school. The first rule is, I am your headmaster. Rule number 2, don't be late. Now, he doesn't need to tell us he's the headmaster. The fact that we're receiving the laws from him should mean that we have a reverence or a need to be accepting this rule. So therefore, argues the Rav Chistai that it's recognition of a commander. The commands need a commander. Observe the Sabbath, but who's telling me to do that? God, who you are now believing in. And he goes even further to say, if you believe, you do not need a command, and if you do not believe, then commanding cannot initiate the belief. In other words, it's pointless to say that the first statement is a command, because miman of shach, whichever way you look at it, it becomes superfluous. If I don't believe, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic, then telling me to believe is not going to change that. And if I do believe, then you don't need to command me anymore. Just tell me what those mitzvot are. That's the first 2 opinions. Now, a majority of the other codifiers of the 613 commands, mostly the Rishonim, which was an amazing period of Jewish studying in and around the 11th to the 15th century, is the Chinuch, the Ramban, the Zohar, not the Zohan. That's a movie, I think. And they say, Anochi, there is a positive command. And this is the words of the Rambam in short and the Chinuch. To know and believe in God. And they say, therefore, it is a mitzvah. God is telling them to know God and to believe in God. Reb Yonah, who is a slightly later Rishon, he says it also is, but he says there's 2 commands. Anochi is the command to believe, and there's another verse, V'yadata, that tells us to know. In synopsis, what we have then is 2 opinions, 2 thought processes. One is the Bahag and Rav Chistoi, and that is that you don't need to command. It's pointless to command to believe. The other opinion is that it is a mitzvah, you need to believe, and you need to know. That is the opinions so far. However, the questions that we may ask on this. Question number one. First of all, Rav Chistoi's question still remains according to Nachmanides and Maimonides. If you are saying that it's a command from God, well, the command needs a commander. And if you believe, you don't need a command. And if you don't believe, then what is the command telling me to subscribe to? And also, what does it mean to know God? Weren't we talking about belief here? How does this know be thrown into the conversation? So the Meiri, who's another Rishon, another rabbi during that time, he responds, he's around the 13th century, he responds, and he loves Maimonides so much that he always looks to answer Maimonides' questions. He says, it goes like this. The question that Rav Chistoi was asking was assuming that in the initial position, either we believe or we don't believe. He says there is an existence of God that we know about cognitively. That's step one. That is reality. Step two is a command. Believe not in the existence of God, because that we've said we've already had. Rather, now that you cognitively have come to a relationship with God, believe that he is most complete, mechuyev hametziut, and he gives a philosophical explanation to what that is. So what we've said over here then is, Meiri is saying like this. Rav Chistoi is asking, what does it mean to command to believe in God? He's asking, he's not believing to command to believe in God. What's he telling you to do? The God that you have already come to understand is there, or you've come to experience. Who is that God? What is that God? Who's talking to you? Who are you going to have that conversation with? Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Through the Torah, you can have a relationship with God. And by the way, it's a lot of fun to do it a different way, to say, well, I believe, and then go off on your own way to ascertain what that belief in, or make it fix to the way, to your comfort of your religion or your faith or whatever your nuances are. But that's not what God wanted. God says, you've come to believe, now let me tell you about who I am through Anochi Hashem Elokecha. So far, what have we said so far? We've said the terms belief and know in English. Anochi, the Bahag and Rav Chistoi said it's not a command. The Rambam and the rest said it is a command. And the Meiri explained that the command is to believe is a step beyond the cognitive God that you've already got. And thereby, he's answered the challenge that was asked by Rav Chistoi. But we still haven't answered, what does it mean to know? To understand what it means to know, in the short bit of time that we have, I'm going to talk about it from a Kabbalistic and a Chassidic perspective as well. First of all, and this might upset the atheists, if somebody says to you, I'm an atheist, or I don't believe, or I am an agnostic, the answer to them is, perhaps up until now, the belief that I've been speaking about, they don't believe in. They don't want to believe in the Torah from Mount Sinai. They don't want to believe in God. They don't want to believe, come to a recognition that God created the world, etc. They can have a choice in that matter. However, the first stage of belief, according to the Kabbalah, is a condition of the soul. And this condition of the soul is not up for conversation. It's like somebody who's had really bad relationships. And because they've had so many bad relationships, they say, you know what? I don't believe in love. It's not they don't believe in love. They've had bad experiences with love, and therefore currently they aren't in love. Now, it's not a good example, but it's the same thing with belief, except it's not within the cognition. The soul has a constant, in its source, a constant relationship with godliness, and therefore it is its reality. The only problem is that reality doesn't come into our cognition. And because it doesn't come into our cognition, we don't experience it. But to the atheists and to anybody else who says they don't believe, you have belief inside the core of you, whether you would like it to be there or not, because it's the essence of one's soul. However, even beyond that, the second stage of belief is, as we've spoken about it from the Meiri, and that is to know. A cognitive recognition that even on this most spiritual of levels of God as the creator, we recognize that God is there. But they take it a step further. The Meiri and other philosophers are only speaking about God as the creator of the world in reference to creation. What is the starting point of when we ask, who is the God who created the world? All of those terminologies, according to the Kabbalah, all fit within Memale Kal Almin, a space of creator within this world that we can all relate to. And therefore it has a cognitive sensation beyond even an understanding. So to know, to have a recognition. Belief then, it goes a step further. It's not a cognitive experience at all. Rather, it's a relationship with Orein Sof, with God, which is higher than creation. Because up until now, we've been only talking about a God in reference to creation. And we want a relationship with God which is even higher than creation. That is what it means to believe, according to the Kabbalah and the Chassidic philosophy. And that is known as Sovev Kol Almin, God beyond creation. Now, we've said quite a lot of information here and a lot of details, and it's a very, and I'm doing it quite briefly, and we can go on and discuss it perhaps later at another time. But in close, I would like to conclude with one point, and it is as follows: to actually reconcile all of the opinions. To know, according to this, the mitzvah to know, and this is what Maimonides commanded us, is to contemplate and meditate on the godliness within creation. That is what the mitzvah to know God is. That we know that God is there, contemplate and meditate on that godliness. Why? Because it is tangible and therefore it will affect change on you. If you want to be a better person in a relationship, you need to meditate on the relationship. You need to think about the sanctity of what that person means to you. And then you might be better within that relationship. If it's a fantasy relationship and the person lives on a cloud cuckoo land and they don't actually live in this world, then it's abstract. We'll talk about that soon. But to know in a relationship, it has to be tangible. The limitation is ultimately you're only grasping an external light of Hashem. To believe, however, is a mitzvah following the previous definition and contemplation. Then you're having emunah in Hashem that is even higher than creation. The effect, you will be able to grasp the highest God levels of godliness within your existence. The limitation, though, as we said, is that it's distant, it's abstract, it's encompassing, and therefore it won't permeate and make a difference. And unfortunately, for many people, this is what their faith is. They believe in some sort of a God, but it doesn't have a daily effect on them. They may take some rituals on, but to permeate their existence, they need to acknowledge it cognitively, build a relationship with it in Mamalik Kalam and within creation, and then leap to the faith, to the belief. I like to call it as a catch-up game. You learn and you know, and you learn and you know, and then you believe. And then you believe less because you know more, and the belief gets elevated to a higher level. And it's a constant catch-up game. So in close, we're actually going to reconcile all of this into one. To know is the Bahagan Rav Chistoi. What did they say? They said God is so apparent and certain. They weren't saying we don't need to believe. They weren't giving you an option to do that. Rather, they're saying is God is so apparent and so certain, it's not a belief. We know he's there, nor can you command me to believe. I can't tell you you're alive or you're in a relationship. You are alive. You feel it. You know you're alive. Nobody can tell you you're not alive. So you don't need to command to have that belief because it's the natural order of knowledge. However, Maimonides says, no, that's not enough. You need a command to know, to have a constant cognitive meditation to effect a change. Think about that knowledge. Connect with that godliness that dwells within the creation. And then there's a command to believe. Where knowledge ends, belief begins. Thank you, and Chag Sameach. Rabbi Yoni.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Menzel, for that lovely presentation. Good evening to each and every one of you, and welcome. It's fantastic to see so many people joining us both here on the Synagogue Zoom page and also on Facebook Live, and a big, big welcome to all of you. So this evening, I'd like to share with you some insights into Shavuot, something to get you in the mood, to get you inspired and excited for the festival that we look forward to celebrate this time tomorrow night. This time tomorrow evening, people will be tucking into their cheesecakes almost, will be getting ready to really accept the Torah. And if I was to ask you, what is the main theme of Shavuot? What is it all about? It's not just about cheesecake. It's much more profound than that. The main theme is, of course, Torah. How 3,332 years ago, our ancestors, in the year 1312 BCE, accepted the Torah, the Jewish year 2448. We received the Torah, and therefore we celebrate. It's a very, very special time. But I wanted to ask you the following question. What is the difference between Shavuot and Simchat Torah? We have another festival in a few months' time called Simchat Torah, where we, on that festival, celebrate accepting the Torah then. So what's the difference between the two? And I want to try and explain. You see in front of me here, I have two specimens to show you. This over here is my beautiful Shabbat Becher, silver Becher, which was bought for us as a wedding gift by my aunt. And this over here is a mug. And this mug was something that Dina and I painted, and I think you can see from the mug, Dina painted it more than I did, on our first date. Now, if I was to ask you which one is more valuable, well, there are different types of values. This, of course, being silver, has a more intrinsic value. It's worth more money. This is not worth very much, but it has a tremendous amount of sentimental value. And it's the same true with Torah. On the one hand, there is an intrinsic value to what Torah is, and that's what Shavuot is about. We celebrate receiving the Torah. On Simchas Torah, we celebrate the giver of the Torah. We celebrate our relationship with the Almighty. And if you look on your source sheets, in source number 1, and I will share my screen with you, for those of you who perhaps don't have the source sheets, let me see if I can figure out how to do this as smoothly as Rabbi Mendel, and let's have a try. Over here, in source number 1, the Torah tells us how, when we celebrate Simchat Torah, when we celebrate Shmini Atzeret, Shivat Yomim, right, we know that on the 8th day we observe a special festival called Atzeret, which is referring to Shmini Atzeret, and Rashi says, very famously, Kosha alai pridoschem, that my separation from you, my parting from you, my beloved Jewish people, is very, very difficult. So therefore, the festival of Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, is a festival that demonstrates the relationship between the Jewish people and God. Whereas Shavuot, all we are trying to do on Shavuot is really try and understand the intrinsic value of what Torah is itself. And what I want to speak about this evening is this idea of appreciating Torah, of making Torah be something that really has value to each and every one of us in our life. You know, the Talmud tells us, and the sages discuss at length, why was the temple destroyed? And there is a famous Gemara, the Gemara in Nedarim Pei Aleph, tells a story as follows. The Gemara describes, Rabbi Yehuda says, in the name of Rav, the following in source number 3 on your sheets, that why was the temple destroyed? So the sages couldn't answer, the prophets couldn't answer, but only the Almighty could answer. And he explains because the Jewish people didn't value the Torah. In fact, Rabbi Yehuda goes on to say, they didn't begin their day by making a blessing on the Torah. For those of you who've been joining us, each and every morning we have our virtual minyan at 8 a.m. Quick plug, quick advert, you're all very welcome. And at the beginning of that service, we begin each and every morning with a blessing on reciting the Torah. Just like a Jewish person makes a blessing on food, just like you make a blessing on wine, there's actually a blessing that you make each and every morning on Torah. Says Rabbi Yehuda in the Talmud, why was the temple destroyed? Because the Jewish people stopped making this blessing. Now the question seems obvious. Is this really a reason for the temple to be destroyed? Does it genuinely deserve a destruction of the temple? Furthermore, we know there's another Gemara in Yuma, which tells us the temple was destroyed for other reasons, because the Jewish people broke the 3 cardinal sins of murder, idolatry, immorality. What's going on? And the Ran, the famous commentator Nissim ben Reuven of Gerona, 14th century sage, commentary on the Talmud, he says the following. He says it's much more subtle than that. You see, Birchas HaTorah, the blessings that a Jew makes in the morning on Torah, it demonstrates their appreciation and value of Torah. Making a daily blessing is showing how much this means to you. You know, the story is told of Rav Noach Weinberg. You may have heard of Rav Noach Weinberg. He was the founder of Or Sameach and Eish HaTorah, one of the greatest Jews of the last century. Very, very great person, very involved in Jewish outreach. And he used to go to the Western Wall and he would pick up people who were visiting, who perhaps were not observant and had no Jewish background. And he would bring them into his yeshiva and he would encourage them to study. But he faced an issue. They hadn't made the blessing on the Torah. And there were two problems. Number one, it was a halachic requirement to make Birchas HaTorah. But number two, educationally, he wanted to show them the right way of making this blessing. So he would say, you know, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to study some Torah together, and Torah is valuable. And I'm going to recite a blessing now. You can say Amen. It's called Birchas HaTorah, the blessing of the Torah. And educationally, he was teaching them that this subject of Judaism, of Torah, it's not physics, it's not biology, it's not mathematics, it's Torah. It has some spiritual value to it beyond any other study in this world. Imagine a professor standing up in university, making a blessing on the subject matter of what he's about to teach. It's an interesting thing. Maimonides, the Rambam, lists all the mitzvot in the Torah. And actually, what's interesting, the Aruch HaShulchan, one of the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, asks the question, why is Birchas HaTorah not listed as one of these 613 commandments? It seems very unusual. And the Aruch HaShulchan says, Shezehu chelek mechelkei ha-mitzvah. This is part and parcel and intrinsic in the mitzvah of studying Torah. In order to study Torah, you have to make the blessing on the Torah because you need to value the matter of which you are studying. You know, there was an interesting story with the Ishbitzer. The Ishbitzer was Reb Mordechai Yosef Leiner, lived 1801 to 1854. And he connected the following with a fascinating ruling, but quoting the Hagos Hashri, another medieval commentator. The following situation took place. Ruvain buys a piece of metal, thinking it's worth, say, £100. He takes it to the market. He thinks it's lead. He sells it for £120. Nice day's work, goes home with £20 profit. Shimon thinks he's done well, £120, he's got a nice piece of metal. It turns out it was silver, and it's worth a huge amount more. Ruvain hears about this. He's furious. He goes back to Shimon and he demands that he pays the full price of silver. They take this question, they discuss it, and the Rav paskins that actually the law is, no, he paid £120 and that's the price. Why? Because he never realized it was silver. If a person doesn't appreciate what he has, you can't put a different value on it. You have to put the value on what the item is in your terms. What do you think it's worth? And it's the same with Torah. Tomorrow night, we are going to be ready to accept the Torah. And this is the festival of intrinsically understanding the power of the beauty of Torah, of what it is and what it means to you. You know, Rabbi Ruderman, who was the Rosh Hashiva of Baltimore, every Shavuot, he used to say the following Devar Torah. He used to quote this Devar Torah in his sermon, in his discourse, when he would speak on Shavuot. And he would say the following. If you look in source number 5, you can see it there. This is a Gemara in Pesachim. The great Rabbi Yosef on the Shavuot, he would prepare a beautiful meal, a beautiful calf. I'm sure you're all cooking your Yom Tov meals, you're all getting ready for tomorrow. And he would say, this is a celebration for receiving the Torah, because if it was not for the Torah, they would say, Kama Yosef Ika B'Shukah. How many Joes, Shmos would there be in the marketplace? I'd just be another Joe. Who would I be without the Torah? In other words, the Torah allowed him, Rabbi Yosef was appreciative of what the Torah was. He understood its value. Rav Ruderman asked the following question. He says, you know, clearly Rabbi Yosef was a great man. Had he not been a Talmud Chacham, a Torah scholar, he would have been great in another area. He would have been a CEO. He would have been a scientist or a doctor or somebody very great. He wouldn't have just been another guy in the marketplace. So why does the Gemara say, Kama Yosef Ika B'Shukah? How many Joes are there in the marketplace? Rav Ruderman gave a beautiful answer. He said, people are fragmented. Human beings are inconsistent. You have the way in which you behave when you're in the workplace. You have the way you behave when you're speaking to your rabbi. You have the way in which you behave when you're on holiday. when you're on the football pitch, when you're with your family, when you're with your friends, when you're with the lads, when you're in a different situation. Human beings are inconsistent. Says Rav Ruderman, when Rav Yosef says, Kama Ika Yosef Pashuka, how many different Joes would there have been in the marketplace? He was trying to say the point that without the Torah, he wouldn't have been able to be the authentic, consistent human being that he was. And therefore on Shavuot, he prepared a special meal to celebrate the authenticity that Torah had added to his life. You know, some weeks ago, we celebrated Shabbat Hagadol. The Shabbat preceding Passover is called the Great Shabbat. Why is it called Shabbat Hagadol? Because we know that actually, in biblical times, it was on that first Shabbat, before we left Egypt, that we took a sheep. We took a baby sheep, which was the god of the Egyptians. We tied it to our beds. And 5 days later, on the 15th of Nisan, we slaughtered it for the Korban Pesach, for the Paschal offering. And that was 5 days later, was of course, the first day of Pesach. So we know biblically that the first time we celebrated Pesach was a Thursday. Now listen carefully, because this is a little bit of a calculation. If we know that Sfirat HaOmer, the days we count of the Omer, on that first Friday, the day after the first Passover, the first day of Passover was day 1. The following Friday was day 8. The following Friday was day 15, 22, 29, 36, 43. The last Friday, day 50, the day we received the Torah, should have been a Friday. However, the Gemara tells us that Matan Torah was actually on Shabbat. So what's going on? Tomorrow night we're celebrating receiving of the Torah. It seems to be we've got the days wrong. This is the famous question of the Mogen Avram, Avram Gomliga, who was known as the Mogen Avram, great sage and rabbi and Talmudist and leading religious authority in the Jewish community in Poland. And he asked this question, famous question. Rabbi Bernstein Zatzal, rabbi of Kinloss Synagogue, he gave a beautiful answer. He said, you know, Shavuot, we celebrate 2 days to contrast what life would be like. 1 day without Torah and 1 day with Torah. In other words, we receive the Torah on the second day of Shavuot, and it's kind of reminding us that we're celebrating what life was like before and how different our life is with and once we've received the Torah. And that's the idea. We say each and every day in Ashra in Avolat Zion at the morning service, again, we say, Baruch Elokeinu shebaronu lichvodo v'hivdilonim min ha'toim v'nosan lonu Toras emes. How great we feel that the Almighty gave us this Torah. It's a treasure. It's more precious than gold and silver and pearls. And that's what Shavuot is about. It's about understanding the intrinsic value of Torah. I want to end with one beautiful idea from the book of Ruth. You know, we all know the story of Ruth. If we don't know it, perhaps look it up, read it over this Yom Tov. It's a very, very special, beautiful story. We all know that Naomi, the mother-in-law of Ruth, her husband Elimelech, and their 2 sons, they died. And Naomi left with her 2 daughters-in-law, with Ruth and Orpah. Now, Orpah decided to return to her idolatrous ways and to head back there, whereas Ruth, she says to her mother-in-law, I'm sticking with you. Wherever you will go, I will go. Your people are my people. You know, when I was young, my father, Oliver Shalom, used to try to make us learn these verses from the book of Ruth off by heart, because they're just so, so beautiful. It's the final source in the source sheet. Ruth said, right, wherever you will go, I will go. Wherever you will lodge, I will lodge. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. A beautiful, beautiful speech where Ruth was trying to explain her commitment and her love of Judaism. In fact, as I'm sure Dayan Binstock can attest from his work in the Beis Din, many of the laws of conversion in Judaism are learned from these verses and from this story, Ruth, of course, being a convert. And it's interesting, we don't encourage conversion. First, we tell them it's so hard. Somebody wants to convert. We explain the challenges that are faced. Lots of laws. For example, one law is Tuchum Shabbat, the amount you're allowed to walk on a Shabbat. So Ruth said, wherever you will go, I will go. I won't go further. There's another law called Yichud, seclusion. You can't be secluded with a member of the opposite sex who's not your spouse or immediate family. But Ruth says, don't worry, wherever you will lodge, I will lodge. And it's an interesting question. A question is asked that Ruth's response doesn't really seem accurate. The response of Ruth should have been, wherever you can't go, I won't go. Wherever you can't lodge, I won't lodge. But instead, she changes it around. She says, wherever you will go, I will go. Wherever you will lodge, I will lodge. Ruth's response was showing her positive excitement and energy about Judaism. She didn't see Judaism as an oppressive, onerous list of do's and don'ts. She saw Judaism as a beautiful, beautiful heritage. She had this positive perspective. In summary, we've learned 6 things this evening. We've talked about the difference between Shavuot and Simchas Torah. We've talked about Birchat HaTorah, the blessing that we made on learning Torah and how integral that is to a Jew. We talked about the Ishbitza, how you can only acquire something when you fully understand its value. Rabbi Yossi, we talked about the authentic consistency that a human being has to have and how Torah brings us that consistency. We spoke about the question of the Mogen Avram, and we spoke about this beautiful insight in Ruth. And the last source on my source sheet, perhaps the most powerful of all, is the inspirational list that I share with you of the transmission of Judaism. We know 3,332 years ago, God gave us the Torah on Mount Sinai. He gave it to Moses, who gave it to Joshua. And we know that there's a heritage that's passed down generation to generation to generation. Pinchas, Eli, Samuel, David, all the way through. This list is documented by Rashi, goes all the way through the centuries, 3rd century BCE, 2nd century BCE. You recognize some of the names on this list, the famous rabbis from the times of the Mishnah, the famous rabbis from the time of the Gemara, Isaiah, Micha, Yoel, Nachum, the prophets as well earlier. And then we go through to the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 4th century, the 5th century. And each and every generation, Judaism was transmitted from teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student. 8th century, 9th century, 10th century. We get to Rashi. Rashi documents this list. This list carries on. The Rashbam, Rabbeinu Tam, the mayor of Rothenburg, myself and Dayan Binstock were privileged to be on a trip with the chief rabbi where we stood at his gravesite. 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, 16th, 17th, 18th century, the Vilna Gaon. We've all heard of the Vilna Gaon, who lists his transmission to Rashi. And from us to the Vilna Gaon is just a short few generations. I talk about my Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Lehrfeld, me, and the Torah that I have the privilege of teaching to you. And this transmission is very much what Shavuot is about. Understanding the value that we are part of a people with an ancient gift called the Torah. Please God, this Shavuot we should merit not just to eat our cheesecake, but to realize what we are celebrating and to do so with tremendous joy. Thank you so much for listening. I'm now going to pass over for the second stage of the evening to our moderator this evening, Rabbi Mendel and Dayan Binstock, if you want to unmute yourselves. And I'm delighted to pass over to Sophia Breslauer, who's going to be moderating our Q&A session.
Hi. Firstly, thank you so much for asking me to moderate today. Briefly, for those who don't know me, my name's Sophia. I'm Lauren and Keith Breslauer's daughter. I currently live in New York. However, I've been part of the St. John's Wood community my entire life, and I still feel very much connected and involved despite the distance. So before we begin, I highly encourage people to ask questions in the chat and comment section, and I'll be moderating from them, and they can be about what was spoken about tonight, about COVID, Shavuot, any general questions you have. And I think on a personal note, I constantly have questions about, navigating Judaism into my own life as I adult. And I think with COVID, that's now, more true than ever with the constantly changing world that we're living in and how to best uphold our Jewish practices. So yeah, whilst we wait for people to write their questions, if you have anyone specific you want to address, please indicate. If you want to speak out loud and not type your question, then also let me know in the chat and I can unmute you to say that out loud. And I guess whilst we wait for questions to come in, I have a question directed for Dayan Binstock, so and related to COVID. So I kind of wanted to ask your opinion, how you predict synagogue attendance and the in-person community will look like once things open up, because on one hand, you can argue people might be rushing back to this community, and another part, they will be slow to come back, not just because for health reasons, but also now there's like the comfort of connecting with Judaism and the community from your home. So that's the first question. And a follow-up for Rabbi Yoni and Rabbi Mendel is how you plan to navigate the popularity of online webinars and Zooms with also encouraging on in-person attendance and an in-person community. So if you want to start, Dayan Binstock.
Hi, Sophia. Thank you very much for, first of all, what you're doing. But what I would say is that the new normal will not be the same as the old normal. We won't go back to where we were before. COVID-19 is going to be with us for some time. And it's going to be a while as we're gradually going to reacclimatize to the new reality, gingerly starting with outdoor services, and then services inside with social distancing. And we're going to have to plan very carefully for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, how to be able to fit more people in the synagogue. We'll have to run parallel services. So a lot of planning is going into that. But even moving beyond that, we have to recognize what we've discovered as a result of COVID-19, where we've actually managed to realize that we notice one another and connect to one another in ways that we hadn't appreciated before. Just like we're doing this evening, we're able to reach out to many of you who wouldn't have perhaps had the opportunity to come to a study session in the synagogue. We're able to connect. So we will be continuing in some form or other a lot of the online work that we're doing now. And the sort of connections that have been made within the community, people noticing each other, the volunteering that's taking place, we're going to build on that. And so I think going forward, we will have a blended community of both the real stuff, getting together as close as we can, or will be allowed to be, because we do have to, we're celebrating each other's physical presence, but at the same time trying to reach out as much as we can on an ongoing basis in a virtual way, making the most of what we discovered during this period. And so it's going to be a very interesting new phase, please God, once we're able to get back to real life communities, still be able to build on and make use of the virtual stuff that we've enjoyed so far. Okay.
And then for Rabbi Yoni and Rabbi Mendel, have you thought about plans for continuing these online webinars and blending that with in-person events? Have you thought about that yet, or is it too early to tell?
Absolutely. We are so excited. I must tell you, there's silver linings. The last few months have been very challenging in many different ways for many different people. In terms of synagogue participation, beyond our wildest dreams, on a daily basis, we've been engaging with hundreds of people. We have a WhatsApp group with over 400 participants. There have been online programming, including shiurim, debates, sermons, interviews. There's been a lot going on. And I'm very excited to tell you that I'm actually launching a new program starting in June called Around the Jewish World in 613 Seconds, where I'm going to be interviewing very briefly characters from across the Jewish world. And I think Rabbi Mendel and Dayan Binstock will agree that right now is an opportunity to strike while the iron's hot. Everyone's excited about this new virtual way, and we need to build on it. And please God, we cannot wait for our shul to reopen. We cannot wait to read from the Torah, to have our minyan for people who are mourning to say KODESH. But we also want to build on what we've had. And I think from my perspective, we very much want to be able to continue the online stuff. We continue with engaging with people and building on the silver linings and working together as a community to try and transport those people virtually within our synagogue community to feel connected. Because ultimately, I think the job of a synagogue, the job of a rabbi is to connect with people and make Judaism feel exciting and relevant. So hopefully we can do that.
Thank you. And then for Rabbi Mendel, I saw a question about the first commandment. So the first commandment states, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Sorry, it just scrolled up. Why does God state who took you out of the land of Egypt? Wouldn't it be more appropriate for God to introduce himself as the creator of the heavens and the earth, etc.?
The answer to that question is the same answer to the question that Keith Breslau has now asked on the chat. and that is, have there been any programs to help the rabbis deal with stress? There's different reasons given. Thank you, Sophia, for hosting and doing this bit of the program. There's different reasons given as to why the Aseret Dibrot begin with this term. I can perhaps ask it even stronger if, according to the opinion, that the word Anochi is actually an Egyptian word. So not only is God saying, taking you out of bondage, he's also using an Egyptian word to describe him. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord. You said Ani is Hebrew. Anochi, according to some, is an Egyptian word. There's two reasons that, the Kuzari is the most famous reason, is perhaps quite an important, pertinent one, and that is because the experience of creation wasn't seen by anybody. Adam comes on the end of it, so we associate God with the miracles of the ones that have just been experienced. From a spiritual perspective, there's one bit more than that. The Torah didn't really have to begin with Bereshis at all. The Torah is not a history book. It's not a cosmological book. It's not a scientific book or a book of physics. So why is it starting with Bereshis? What is the importance? So the reality is that the whole Torah is about the Anochi that we're trying to lead up. So I guess the real question is not why does God introduce himself as Anochi took you out of Egypt, but why do we know God is the creator of the world? And that goes back to the previous point that I was mentioning, and that is that ultimately we want to have a relationship with God beyond being creator of the world. And that's why we use the word Egypt, that within our own confinements, within our own little exiles, within our own little bubbles, within our own little worlds that we create for ourselves whether we're 15, 20, 25 or 75, those realities that we have for ourselves and the limitations that we've created and others may have created on us, we need to redeem ourselves from those places. And that's why Mitzrayim becomes an extremely important part of that revelation of God that is greater than creation, but within its deepest constraints.
Sorry, as a general point, some people have been sending questions to my sister, who's also on the Zoom privately. So please post them to everyone, or my name's Sophia, send it to me. But another question, I don't know who this is from, but for Rabbi Binstock, going beyond the moon, beyond Mars, is there belief on life on other planets beyond our solar system? I don't know if there's a Jewish view or answer on that.
Hi, thanks for that question. Hello. Am I live?
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, thanks for the question. It is something that Judaism is quite happy to debate as to whether there is life on another planet. In fact, the very early discussion is found in the writings of Judah Halevi of Barcelona from the 12th century. And it's interesting that he contemplates not whether life on other planets is more intelligent than us, but whether it is more moral than us. Are they better behaved? What sort of Torah might beings on another planet have? And so it's not a problem as to whether we're the only intelligent address in the universe. But our responsibility is to deal with our universe, with our experiences, etc. Could there be life in other planets? Maybe, but it wouldn't be a problem from a Jewish point of view. And
just to follow up, is there mention of or acknowledgement of the potential for life on other planets from? Is it more modern that this is discussed, or are there older texts and when that's mentioned?
I just mentioned a very early text to say that the medieval, at least one medieval philosopher thought about it and didn't regard it as a theological problem. There would be theologians to say that man is unique and he's the only intelligent being in the universe, and therefore we would regard that as problematic, whether there should be life on other planets. I don't think that would be the case. We could live comfortably with the fact that there might be life on other planets. We wouldn't regard that as a theological problem for Jews. There may be another chosen people somewhere else in the universe, maybe.
Thank you.
Can I?
Sorry, continue.
Dayan, with your permission, if I could also add, it's interesting, I think even earlier, even in the book of Judges, in the book of Devorah, I believe there's a Rashi, where Rashi refers to cursed as another nation, and Rashi refers to it being on another planet. So there are really early commentators that also reflect on this. But on a practical level, I don't know how much of a difference that would make to me and you in 2020 and our observance and connection to mitzvot.
Thank you. So from Sylvia Abraham for Rabbi Yoni, you mentioned Simchas Torah as a separate festival from Shavuot, but why didn't we start reading the Bereshit straight away after receiving the Torah?
Very interesting. Very, very good question. So in my presentation, I discussed the idea of the intrinsic value of Torah and also the sentimental value. And if I was to ask you, if Michael, Sylvia, was to invite you out for an anniversary date on the first time he saw you, it perhaps wouldn't be as meaningful as your wedding day, because your wedding day is the sentimental moment when you celebrate that, so to speak. And I think the answer may be that Simchas Torah, seeing that's the anniversary of our sentimental relationship of Torah, of our relationship with the giver of Torah, it therefore follows to begin that cycle on that anniversary where we commemorate that. I don't know if Dayan Binstock or Rabbi Menzel wants to add to that, but I think that seems logical to me.
Yeah, I mean, Simchas Torah is a relatively late festival. It's only in earlier times it wasn't known. It's just simply the second day of Shemini Atzeres. And originally the Torah was being read every 3 or 3.5 years. And it was the Babylonian custom to read it only in 1 year. And it was only at a later stage, after the Talmud was completed, you start to find a day of a second day of Shemini Atzeret, given a slightly different theme of Simchat Torah. There were occasions in earlier times when they did begin the reading of the Torah earlier. So, as I say, it's only from about sort of the 9th century onwards that Simchat Torah, as the day on which you start to read the Torah, starts to emerge. And then what originally the customs that we had for Shavuot were transferred to Simchat Torah. So originally there used to be celebrations on Shavuot of the Torah, and then when Shavuot took on a separate nature when Simchat Torah took on a separate nature as the day we're celebrating the completion of the Torah, some of those celebrations were transferred. In the Targum Moshe in the Megillas Esther, when Haman is talking about there's a community that has a nation that has different customs, the Midrash goes there through all the months of the year, and they talk about on Shavuot throwing apples, which became later a Simchat Torah custom. And there is a tune that we're going to use for Akdamus. Well, we can't sing it this year, which is the same tune we use on Simchas Torah for the Rishus when we call out the Chosim Torah. So the customs got transferred from Shavuot to Simchat Torah.
I have a great question from Matthew Hirschfeld for Dayan Binstock, but again, Rabbi Yoni, Rabbi Menzel, you can also answer. I understand some of the holidays were intended to align with the seasons, and on another planet, those seasons may not be the same. If we were to colonize another planet, how do we go about observing the Jewish holidays, since the holiday calendar follows the lunar calendar?
Well, it basically follows from my presentation before that if you follow through this idea that once you are out of the Earth's orbit, then the mitzvot wouldn't be obligatory upon you anymore, then you would have a problem. According to some of the authorities I mentioned, we would still have a responsibility to do things, at least in a rabbinic way, to remind ourselves of it. And so, hypothetically, were there to be a Jewish colony on the moon or on Mars, we would want them to be keeping Shabbat. We want them to keep Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, Simchat Torah, etc., as a reminder of what the original Earth requirements are. But when we're to get to that stage, maybe the transportation, whether they can solve the problem, what appears to be from Einstein's equations to not get us there as fast as we would wish, I don't know. But then we would still be doing things at least to remind us of what traditional observances were, even if it wouldn't be, say, biblically required anymore.
Then another planet-based question from Vincent, referencing the Song of Devorah, cursed is Meroz, cursed are her inhabitants, because they did not come to the assistance of God among the mighty ones. And the question was, as God created life on other planets, did God create every planet / life at the same time?
A big question. What we're saying that I don't have a problem with the Big Bang theory, that God creates physics, and there can have been a Big Bang out of which there is an expansion, and out of which planets are formed, galaxies are formed, and then planets are formed, etc. And so at whatever stage that in that process of development, So then the galaxies were formed and the planets were formed within those galaxies. Irrespective of, we look at it from our perspective, in our galaxy, in our solar system, in our planet, and that's our responsibility. How it took place in other galaxies when there's millions of light years away, we have no knowledge of, but it's all starting from the same source and has developed outwards.
If I could just come in over here on this point for a moment, it's often what people do with these sort of questions is they create the gap God. That's what one controversial guy in The Challenge of Creation did, and that is that they sort of try to create a God that the more knowledge we have, the more we sort of push God back one step more. This is just reference to God and the world and creation in general. In many ways, as we become more and more advanced with journeying in relativity and into space and way beyond, and even the Big Bang Theory itself, which by the way is only a theory, it's not a truth. We don't know what happened 6 weeks ago in China. We certainly don't know what happened 14 billion years ago, when all these things may have happened or may not have happened. But the point that there is that, and in many ways Stephen Hawking tries to do this, he tries to push God even further by explaining how mathematically, within numbers, a Big Bang can happen without a God. So God keeps getting thrown sort of in all these different directions to sort of reconcile with creation. If there are other worlds, first of all, where life is on, Dayan sort of mentioned it a little bit before, they certainly can't have free choice. Because if they had free choice, then they would have to have a Torah. Because Torah is the direction of explains how free choice can happen. And since God told us that there was only one revelation at Mount Sinai, if there was a parallel universe, the Torah is not truth. It's a parallel truth that exists in many other places. So it's not necessarily consistent to have it all the way through. But there might be life on other planets, and it would be amazing to find them one day. What kind of level of life? Nobody is assuming there is conscious life. There might be a little bit of water that may have had life, or I've read a lot on it, and there's nobody who's sort of looking to hope find a person on Zoom right now with COVID going on. It's the likeliness of that is not really what they're looking for.
And sorry, also for anyone who doesn't know how to use the chat, you can feel free to unmute yourselves and to just ask your questions that way. But yeah, thank you everyone so far for great questions. From Nick Levine, and for Rabbi Yoni, do we celebrate Shavuot with milk, halav, because halav adds up to 40 and the Torah took 40 days to come down to us?
Okay. Hi, Nick. Lovely question. Interesting question. There is, of course, a custom to have dairy foods on Shavuot. And it's a custom, as you've alluded to in some of in your question already, that chalav, milk, is the numerical value, ches lamed bet is the numerical value of 40, which represents the 40 days that Moses was on Mount Sinai. It's also the idea that milk gives nourishment. And our newborn baby, all he's ever eaten is milk, because milk nourishes a person in the same way, metaphorically, that Torah nourishes a person. So there's that aspect to it as well. It's actually interesting. Shavuot is one of the festivals that there are actually no specific laws, in the same way that you have on Pesach eating matzah and Seder night and 4 cups of wine, and you have on Sukkot sitting in a sukkah and shaking the lulav etrog. When it comes to Shavuot, and it's all minhag, it's all custom, and there are 5 customs, including dairy foods, reciting Akdamas that Dayan Binstock spoke about earlier, Megillas Rus, reading the Book of Ruth, and having flowers. Gentlemen, don't forget to buy your wives and ladies beautiful flowers tomorrow if you can. Socially distance, do that. And of course, the idea of tikkun leil, staying up all night. But this idea of eating milk has become very much a custom. Somebody actually asked me today, Rabbi, is it forbidden for me to eat meat on Shavuot? So I told him if he eats it with the milk, then yes, it is of course forbidden. But there is no problem to have milk and meat separately on Shavuot. In fact, some people have the custom to do that. And it's an important custom, but there are various reasons why we have milk. First one being that we just spoke about, but also there's another reason that on that very first Matan Torah, when we received the Torah 3,300 years ago, the laws of preparing meat are complex. You need to sharpen the knife, you need to find the kosher species, you need to do shchita, slaughtering it, you need to clean it, to salt it, to remove the blood, to remove all the sinews, etc., and therefore that's complex. So that first Shavuot, some of the commentators say they weren't ready for that. So they stuck with a bowl of cereal or a cheese sandwich. They kept it simple, so to speak. But there are various reasons. So I recommend you enjoy perhaps both a nice meat meal and a nice milk meal, keeping some hours in between them, obviously, which is, of course, the custom.
Good.
Possibly an interesting historical dimension to milk foods on Shavuot is Shavuot was also the time the children were introduced to the Jewish studies. It's when little children in Europe were taken to shul for the first time to learn their Torah. And they were presented with a slate on which there will be letters with milk and honey. And the children would lick the letters off the plate, and as the verse says, milk and honey under your tongue. And the Shavuot was seen as an occasion to start a Jewish education. And from that idea, so milk associated began associated with Shavuot from the introduction for children for Jewish education. So that's what some historians suggest as an origin as well.
And of course, Dayan Binstock, Nick, you'll realize the very first Shavuot, we weren't planning on spending 40 years in the wilderness. We were planning to go straight after Matan Torah, straight from receiving the Torah into the land of milk and honey. It should have followed on seamlessly. But of course, we sinned in the golden calf and we weren't worthy of that, and we spent 40 years wandering. But therefore, there is that link as well. There's also a custom on Hanukkah. It's an interesting thing. The Gemara says that one of the decrees of Hanukkah that the Greeks gave the Jewish people is that they forced them to take the Keren Hashar, the horn of an ox, and to inscribe in it, in a similar way to what Dayan Binstock just said, Ein lanu chelek b'Elokei Yisrael. You have no portion in the God of Israel. Why was that? Why did they tell them to do it on the horn of an ox? Because in biblical times, those were the baby bottles. And they knew that that baby, having a Jewish education, was going to be what would keep the Jewish people going. They wanted to destroy that. They wanted to destroy education. So therefore, milk is a symbol, represents the idea of nurturing. And I think that's also very much part of it.
So, Sophia, I notice you keep skipping your dad's question. So I'm going to go in and ask, your dad's asked the same question now twice. So there's two questions he's asked. One of them I know because I'm a Cohen as well, so I have an interest. And the other one is the age one. So I want to begin with the age one. Will minyanim be split by age? I'm not talking on behalf of policy, but I personally think that the whole country may need to split by age. It's not just about the minyanim. If some people are I know the nursery is opening in St. John's Wood Synagogue, actually one of the first in any of the United Synagogues, because they're able to go to school. So they may have to split. But in terms of the question about special obligations to the customs of a daughter of a Cohen, of which Sophia is, they are actually the Torah that in the Chumash there are differences. Firstly, a single Kohen girl is considered a Cohen in terms of what she can eat and living in her father's home. Once she gets married, she loses some of those if it's to an Israelite. The sages in the Talmud tell us that a Cohen daughter is allowed to demand or expected to demand a higher level of money on her ketubah. Because and the Arizal and some of the Kabbalists explain that it's because when you marry a Cohen girl, you're guaranteed to have a good home. So Sophia, you got a lot of expectations, and I know there are some more later rabbis who have said minimally if a non-Cohen is marrying a Cohen girl, she should marry a Talmud Chacham. Minimally, they should study an extra portion of Talmud or something. So it's a big zechus to marry a Cohen. But you're okay, Keith, because your daughter's already a Bas Cohen. And whether she marries a Cohen or not, the main thing is she should marry a lovely boy, and it should be very soon, and we should all be dancing at the Simcha speedily.
So I guess leading off.
Follow that one up, Sophia.
Yeah. Okay. So the questions about splitting up by age and related to COVID. I've been reading about a lot of companies have plans to bring people back on a priority system. So whether that be, senior managers and partners first, or, younger associates first. Have there been conversations about that when synagogues first open? I know if so, if there have been conversations, what will that look like?
So I sit on a committee called the Restart Committee in the United Synagogue, and we're just planning on a number of levels. So there are various stages. We've got to get ourselves at the first phase to start opening so we can have daily services and Shabbat services, a further degree of planning of how we're going to manage the much larger group of people that want to come for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and then how we're going to manage after that as well. Hello?
Rivka, if you can mute yourself.
Yeah. Right. So we're going to have to work it out as far as our communities are concerned, what will suit each community. And we don't want to be too prescriptive, because we recognize communities are different. They have different age profiles. They have, you can have a very active community of some older members. You can have a not very active community that's got younger members, and vice versa. And so we want to we will be giving out broad guidelines which each community will be able to apply in their own way. The first thing many shuls are going to have to do is do an audit of their premises and try and work out how many people they can fit in with social distancing in the different rooms they have available for services. It may be that some shuls might have to rent extra premises for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur so that we can have parallel services. We're probably going to have a few services on Rosh Hashanah day and on Yom Kippur day, maybe like a first slot, an 8 to 9:30, a 10 to 11:30 service, and so that we can be able to fit in as many people as we can, but within the social guideline limitations of the numbers that we will be restricted to. So this is part of the planning we're engaged in.
Right, thank you for sharing. And I'm sure that's, ever changing as time changes. Another question that I was asked was, would rabbis permit minyanim to occur in gardens? And has there been discussion on that?
Well, minyanim are already taking place in gardens in parts of London. And what people are doing in their own homes is okay. I mean, if you've got a garden minyan of say 2 or 3 gardens and they can hear and see each other, that's fine. You can have a minyan. As far as a synagogue itself to open up, we have to be responsible for our premises. If they're being used, we've got a duty of safety, of care and safety to those who are coming onto our site. And so we can't just open in an ad hoc way. We've got to make sure that if people come into our premises, we have a responsibility for them. The place is properly cleaned and disinfected before and after use and so on. And so if people want to organize an ad hoc minyan between a couple of houses where there are enough people, they can go ahead now and do that. But for a synagogue to open up, even to have an outside minyan, we've got to do so responsibly.
I'm sorry, actually following up what you spoke about earlier about potentially having different sessions during Rosh Hashanah services and opening up the synagogue. If there's a cap on how many people can be there, would men be prioritized over women, or how would that look like, just because halachically it might be different?
We want to give every opportunity to women to be there as well, but we look at the limitations. I started to think about this morning in one of the Zoom meetings we had, is that people were saying, well, if you've got 15 Kaddish says and then there's a Simcha, you can only fit in 15 people, what can you do? So these are issues that we're going to have to do. And there may be times when we might have to say to someone, look, we'd like you to step back from the morning service this week because there's a guy who wants to come and say and name a baby, or a young man wants to come up and put on tefillin for the first time, and we're limited, shall we say, to 15 people. So we're going to have to work this out. We'll have to ask people to appeal to their generosity and try and be fair and try and be transparent. And we'll want to know, some people may feel not so keen to come back. They maybe feel a bit apprehensive. So we'll have to survey from the membership as how many people are really wanting to come, and cater within that need in each of our communities.
Thank you. So from David, for Rabbi Mendel, what is the soul?
What is the soul? That's a great question. David, Ishkar. The soul, what is the soul? Well, one of the points that we touched upon in the presentation earlier was the meditation on godliness that is within the world. And there's a verse in Job that says, Mibsori echze Eloka. which literally means, well, not literally, in the Kabbalistic term, it means from my flesh, I perceive godliness. And the Kabbalists use this as a meditation to attain a connection to God through the direction of their own consciousness and their own soul. So in order to understand and perceive godliness, it begins by perceiving a person's soul. So when we talk of the soul, there are different dimensions to the soul. There's different expressions of the soul. But the most important thing to understand is that anything I say about the soul is not because I experience my soul any more than you experience your soul. My soul is spiritual as much as your soul is spiritual. Rather, we refer to texts and to rabbis and to sages that have had a closer connection to spirituality and perhaps therefore felt their soul in stronger ways. And therefore, when we think of soul or speak about soul, it is to them that we should be focusing on to understand those things. So I mean, rather than just trying to give an answer to an extremely long question on here, I would say the first level of your soul is when you close your eyes and you meditate with your feet on the ground, so you're not running anywhere, and you're able to consciously come to the center of your forehead, beyond any of your stresses or any of your desires or any of the things that are bothering you. At that central point is the beginning journey to find the soul. But a lot of the soul also hangs out just above your head. But this is a really, really deep topic, which I'm not sure we can cover too much of it on here. Thank you, David.
I can just add a very brief thought that there's a lovely metaphor that's used in the Kabbalistic literature of the glass blower. That when the glass blower blows through a pipe and the soft glass comes into a shape, then the glass blower's breath from within the glass blower is now inside that piece of that glass shape it's created. And that expands the metaphor of God breathing into Adam and creating the breath of life and within him and making Adam into a living being. And we're saying that there's part of God within us, that's our soul, that God has that's animated from God within us, that gives us our spiritual activism. And so that's the metaphor of the glass blower to try and explain at least one element of the soul that's within us.
Thank you. Another private question is, why are the 10 Commandments distinct from the other 613 mitzvah in the Torah? If not, are they more important? If not, why are they given separately? So that can be for Rabbi Mendel or whoever else.
It's interesting. In America, there was debate about the courthouses, whether they should have the 10 Commandments at all the courthouses. And generally, the 10 Commandments became sort of this accepted thing beyond the Jews in terms of what they represent. But the reality is that's not necessarily the case. In fact, Shabbat, for example, it is a real problem if a non-Jew observes Shabbat, according to the sages, and they write a non-Jew is not allowed to necessarily observe the Shabbat. They're breaking the laws of nature to not work. Man is meant to work, so how dare you take a day off? As an example, so the general universal elements of the 10 Commandments are not necessarily as we have perceived them. Rather, there are 7 commands that are unique for humanity that the Jewish people should be really pushing, as it were. But why these 10 commands were specifically chosen? There's different explanations given. Some of the most significant ones is because it's the fundamental ones that within it include all of the mitzvot, and some sages have been able to find all the 630 hidden within the words. There is also the two sides of it, obviously, between God and man, and man and other man, which are the second half of it. I will defer now if any of the rabbis, I'm sure, would like to add.
Sure. If I could just add very briefly, just also on the soul. I can jump back like a true rabbi, go from one subject to another, right? In terms of the soul, I think another beautiful way of looking at it, as Dayan Binstock reflected in Bereshis, right, when Adam HaRishon, the first man, the Torah describes in Genesis chapter 2, the Almighty breathed into him the soul of life, and this nefesh, this Selem Elokim that we are created in, the image of God. What does that mean? We as human beings are different to any other creature in this world. We have something called bechira, free will. And the soul is supposed, so to speak, that part of you. It's like you imagine a light bulb without the electricity. You're a light bulb and your soul is the electricity. That's what pumps you and spiritually connects you with your source, with the Almighty. And our whole life long, we have this challenge: are we a body with a soul or a soul with a body? And this is really part of that challenge. But in terms of the 10 Commandments, it's a very interesting thing. Originally, we used to recite the 10 Commandments as part of the daily service. Every single morning, that was part of the service. And there was actually a problem that people would say, well, these 10 are the only important ones and not all of them. But as Rabbi Menzel said, I believe it's the Rabbeinu Bachya, who says that actually within each of the 10 Commandments, you can find the source for every single mitzvah. So for example, all the laws of marriage, divorce, relationships would be in Commandment 7, do not commit adultery. Or Commandment 4, keep Shabbat, all the laws of festivals, of Chagim, of Yom Kippur, of Sukkot, etc., etc. Each commandment in the Torah has a link to those 10 commandments. So these 10 quintessential commandments really summarize and connect us with all 613. Obviously, in today's world, out of the 613, there are many of those commandments we can't practically keep. We don't have a temple. We don't live in Israel, so some of that rules out some for men, some for women, some for Kohanim, some for Leviim, but all different parts of the Jewish people. But the 10 Commandments really at its core are those 10 quintessential commandments that each and every one of us try and tap into and connect to on our own level. Sophia, back to you.
Thank you. Another question for Rabbi Yoni from my dad. Will you continue the excellent interview series of members of our community post-COVID? I know you mentioned the WhatsApp group and keeping that up, but yeah, what are your plans for that?
Well, I want to tell you, I've thoroughly enjoyed this project. It's been for me a very exciting project. And I think it was Beverly Jane Stewart, Andrew Mainz's wife, said beautifully in her interview that how, in a certain ironic sense, even though we haven't seen each other for almost 3 months, we feel much more connected because we know so much more about each other, and we feel more connected as a result of the interviews because we've got to meet a lot of people through the community. I definitely want to carry on. I think, like with any project, there needs to be fresh energy, fresh excitement. And that's why I mentioned I'm starting this new series around the Jewish world in 613 seconds. But of course, the virtual programming, we're going to keep them going. I've still got 4 or 5 interviews that I haven't aired that I'm going to air over the next couple of weeks with some really interesting people, from Rabbi Pini Dunner, who was the predecessor of Rabbi Menzel, who's the Rabbi in Saatchi, from other interviewees, including Isaac Herzog, who is a very prestigious Israeli member, the chairman of the Jewish Agency. We've got an amazing interview with Stella Lucas, who, if I give a shout out, she's with us here this evening at 9:45. Please God, she's going to be 104 years old this July. So I've interviewed her to find out what keeps her going and how does she have this boundless energy. So we've got some exciting stuff coming. And as we said earlier, the online projects, they're going to get more and more exciting. And please God, we cannot wait to continue making St. John's Wood the vibrant community that it is.
Thank you. And to add, I live in.
Can I just also mention? I know your mum is very proud that your dad's videos had more views than Eyal Booker. So I think, Keith, that's a tremendous achievement from your part.
Thank you. And I just want to say that not living in London and not really being present in the St. John's community in person for a long time, these interviews have definitely, made me revisit the community and feel connected again. So thank you for that.
Sophia, I'm going to ask a question. Okay. You won't answer it if I don't ask it to you. So one of the issues that people in our shul have asked me is that you go to Columbia University, which is one of the best schools in America, but has a bit of a reputation about the BDS. So can you tell us a little bit about what the BDS movement is doing in the U.S. and what, if you're doing anything about it? You don't mind me asking? I think people would be interested to know about it.
Great question.
So, I can talk about Columbia specifically. I think the BDS movement as a whole have, in the last few years, focused on getting universities to support the movement. So, from rejecting, donations with Israelis or investing school tuition with Israeli-related companies, to, on a more extreme level, blocking Israeli speakers, Israeli professors. So a few years ago, they started to get schools throughout the world to support the BDS movement. At Columbia and other schools in the States, how the school would support it would be through student council passing a vote to the wider student body, who would then agree or not agree with the BDS movement. If they support the BDS movement, then it would go to the Columbia administration to then support the BDS movement from there. The Columbia administration has already issued a statement saying they will not support the BDS movement. President Bollinger, who's the president of the university, released quite a lengthy statement on the Columbia website in which he condemned the BDS movement and the supporters of the movement on our campus. However, they have passed a vote from the student council, so the student body in the fall will be voting on whether they support the BDS movement or not. The problems that have come, I'll try to keep this as short as possible, but the problems that have come with the anti-Israel movements is that, especially at Columbia, they have reworded what it means to be a Zionist, as if saying Zionist is racist, Zionism is coupled with white supremacy, as if these are given truths, when actually they're not, and they're their own opinions. So once they've started saying that so often, the medium student who has no idea what's going on believes that to be true. So the pro-Israel community on campus have worked and are working, including myself, on kind of, taking back that narrative, whether that be through events or tabling. We obviously speak to student council, the administration. We try and publish op-eds in Columbia, newspapers, and so on and so forth. But it is very much a struggle, and I do not know what the solution is to the BDS movement as of now. So yeah. Anyway, as a final, if anyone else has any other questions.
Sophia, can we just commend you for the very cogent piece that you wrote in one of the student newspapers?
Thank you. Yeah, so that piece was just specifically talking about the anti-Israel organizations on campus and their tactics in silencing people from engaging in the conversation, and like I said, rewording what it means to be a Zionist. Actually, I tried, once the article was published, a response piece was published, and the political magazine, the Columbia Political Review, received a lot of I wouldn't say backlash, a lot of complaints from the anti-Israel movements for publishing this article. I tried to publish another one about something else, about the pay for slave program that happens in Israel, and I was told yesterday that they don't want to publish it because they don't want to deal with the huge pool of negative response that they got from the last article. So again, it's another tactic of silencing that happens, not just on Columbia's campus, I'm sure other campuses in the wider world. Yeah. So to, I guess, just a final question and on a lighter note, Dayan Binstock, do you want to start, and then Rabbi Yanni, Rabbi Menzel to finish. What are your best tips for celebrating Shavuot at home during this time?
You got to have good cheesecake, you got to have good coffee, and you need to have, if you have the opportunity to be blessed with a wonderful partner around you that always asks the best questions and offers you the best tips. So that's really my opportunity for a lovely Shavuot, to be able to spend it at home in the company of my wife, where we can talk and learn and eat and sleep and do the wonderful things we want to do on Shavuot. I must say, I know my rabbinical colleagues, I'm sure, will agree, one of the benefits that rabbis have found over this COVID period, we discovered the beauty of Shabbat and Yom Tov. Previously, we worked during the week, and we worked very hard on Shabbat. Now we're working much harder during the week, but we're resting on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And so I really identify with my congregants who have the opportunity of resting on Shabbat every week. During this COVID period, we've really enjoyed Shabbat. And so Shabbat and Yom Tov for us is a wonderful, beautiful experience we've not had for many, many years. Okay.
I look forward to hearing all about Rebbetzin Binstock's cheesecake, which I'm sure is legendary, as is Rebbetzin Golker's. You can see that I really do enjoy it. But if I could just share with you some tips to make sure your Shavuot is something special. What we're going to be doing in the Golker house is we're going to be having a all-night sleepover in the lounge. So my children are very excited because we're going to be having a slumber party with pajamas and duvets in the living room. And my wife and I prepared a bit of a schedule where we're going to be telling the kids stories, and we're going to try and give them that flavor of what I spoke about earlier, explaining to them how exciting Torah is. You know, every morning, every Shabbat morning in our house, if you arrive here at about 8 a.m., we have something called a Shabbat party, where the kids come down and they have much too much sugar. And they sit around the living room table and they enjoy it. And if you ask any one of my children, what is your favorite day of the week? They will tell you it's Shabbos, because they're so excited. If you want to try and raise children who are excited about Judaism, and please God, I should be blessed to be saying the same thing in 10 years from now. But the greatest advice I can give you is make sure that Judaism is an exciting thing, not just an onerous list of do's and don'ts. This Shavuot, of course, will be unusual. Many people are isolated, many people are by themselves. And to those people, I say, still try and make something special about this Shavuot, whether that's cheesecake or whether that's a print-off of things you're going to be learning. I want to commend Rabbi Menzel, who's been organizing incredible packs that have been going out with educational content for Shavuot. If you don't have one of those and you'd like one, please let us know. We'll try and get one to you. But make sure it's a different couple of days. It's not just 2 days without electronics where you're just wishing that you could make Havdalah. Make sure those days count and make sure that you find some way to be inspired. And please God, I cannot wait till next Shavuot, when we'll be celebrating together in St. John's Wood Synagogue. And like we've got 70 people here online with us, we had earlier this evening, another bunch of people online. We're going to all be in the synagogue together, celebrating and enjoying cheesecake and Torah in its truest sense.
I mean, when you have so many rabbis speaking, it's very difficult to be original. But my wife's cheesecake's better than his wife's and their wife's cheesecake. I can guarantee you my wife's cheesecake is better than anybody else's. But on a serious note, first of all, if you want to make your Shavuot more meaningful, pick up the phone tomorrow and call somebody and wish them a happy Shavuot, especially if you think they're going to be on their own. When you make somebody else's experience meaningful, then your experience becomes meaningful. Second thing, most people don't know about Shavuot. Somebody texted me last week to say when he sent it to his assistant to put Shavuot in the calendar, he said, where's that meeting going to take place? People don't know what Shavuot is. The reason they don't know what Shavuot perhaps is, because we've done a really good job at making Judaism feel good. Shabbat, it's so nice to turn off your phone for 26 hours. That's not why we keep Shabbat. It might also have that benefit. So Pesach, everybody loves freedom. So Pesach is a really good festival where everybody participates. Sukkot of the Shalosh Regalim is one where people see the joy of coming together, singing, and outside, different elements to it. Shavuot isn't popular because it's the Torah. It's much easier to enjoy pleasures which don't always necessarily demand things of us. So I think this Shavuot, as we stay perhaps in our homes or we go out for walks and we come interact with other people, develop a stronger relationship with the Torah. And I think people ask what's going to be was one of the questions when we come back. I don't know what's going to be. I think people may be excited to come to shul after 1 week and then they might not come back the following week. So what we need to do is connect with our Yiddishkeit in a personal way and accept the Torah anew like it's never been given before to each and every one of us in a personal way. And God should bless us to liberate us physically and spiritually from the conditions that we find ourselves in, both in terms of the COVID, but in general in each and every one of our journeys, that we should be reunited and celebrate Shavuos in the Beis HaMikdash all together with Mashiach speedily in our days in good health. Thank you so much.
Here.
Amen to that.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. It was, a very fascinating, interesting talk, covering a very wide spectrum of topics in Judaism. So for those who are not on the WhatsApp group, Facebook, every way to stay connected to the community, I highly encourage you to do so. If you have questions about that, reach out to Rabbi Yoni, Rabbi Menzel, Dayan Binstock, and they can get you connected. So thank you again to everyone. Happy
Great
Shavuot.
job, Sophia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Good job. Good job.
Thanks so much, everyone, and thanks, Sophia. Amazing.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely Yom Tov.
everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you,
darling.
darling.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Mendel. Thank you, Yoni.
Sophia, יישר כוח.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Rabbanim and Sophia. It was a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
See everybody at 8 o'clock.